Satan wants your marriage to fail. He hates the institution of marriage. We believe it's his biggest target. In fact, we believe that he depends on your marriage failing to complete his agenda here on earth. Now in this video, we're going to show you why Satan hates marriage so badly, and we're going to prove to you how it's been his biggest target since the beginning.
So stay with us to the end and be prepared to have your minds blown. And may the Spirit of God be with you as you watch and listen, so that you may have the eyes to see and the ears to hear what the Bible reveals.
Okay, this could seriously be a documentary series, but we're going to try and do this in a reasonably short video. But because of that, we have to warn you that we're going to open some loops that don't get completely closed and maybe spark some questions that don't get fully answered. So if you want more, please subscribe, leave a comment, and look for follow-up content on our channel. We've got to create some context for this, for what we're about to reveal, so stay with us. And don't miss the bomb that we're going to drop near the end. Now, the reason we're doing this video is because we made a shocking discovery, and we feel that we've got no choice but to share it.
We decided that after 14 years of teaching, coaching, and writing about marriage and exhausting the resources available to us, that we needed to know what the Bible said about marriage, and were we in for a surprise. We discovered that our formulas and philosophies for having a great marriage are in fact very congruent with the Bible, but we also discovered that we've been playing at an amateur level in both our own marriage and in our own teachings. If you're a Christian, you know in your heart that God has a design for everything, right? A design that, when followed, gives you the best case scenario. Do you agree with me on that? And it doesn't matter when it was said, God's words and commands are everlasting. In other words, you have to know and believe that following God's design will give you the best experience possible, an optimal experience. And you also know that God's design is probably very different than what is mainstream and popular in society today. Would you agree with me on that?
And you would also have to agree that as Christians, we often don't trust that following God's word will give us the best outcome. This is because Satan, the great deceiver, he's duped us into believing that what is in many cases the very opposite of what is best for us, what is optimal for us. And we can pretend that God's laws and principles for optimal living are archaic and outdated, but that's like saying that the laws of physics are archaic and outdated. We can try to defy them because we don't like them, but all we can do in our defiance is we break ourselves on them. Does that make sense? Okay, let's go to the Bible and see what it says about marriage. We're going to move really fast, so stay with us. Now, biblically speaking, the creation of a man and a woman, it's the last thing that God does immediately before sanctifying the seventh-day Sabbath in Genesis 2, verses 1 and 3. But that's another discussion. In this discussion, it's about God's biblical mandates for marriage that Satan is working overtime to destroy, and why he is hell-bent on destroying them. So what is a mandate? It's an instruction, an order, a directive. It's a decree. Now, I'm reminding you of this so that as we go through these Bible texts, you can ask yourself, does this sound like a mandate? Does it sound like an instruction, an order, or a decree? Marriage is a tradition that's been practiced by all civilizations since the beginning of recorded history.
It is the very backbone of a civilization. The great Zig Ziglar once said that every civilization in history that abandoned or dishonored the institution of marriage became weak and self-destructed. That's because marriage is the foundation of a stable society. It is the incubator of humanity's future. Aristotle was originally attributed as saying, "Give me a boy until the age 7, and I will show you the man." What they meant was that by the age of 7, a child's programming is done and the trajectory of their life virtually set. This is because the environment they live in and the influences around them up to that point are what shapes their values, their self-esteem, and their worldviews. It's what's shaping their beliefs about the world and the filters they see, interpret, and process the world through.
Their sense of ethics and morality and their beliefs about God are largely shaped and influenced by the examples and the congruence or the lack thereof of their parents. I mean, we as parents, we are incubating the future of our country. Everything we do, every action that we take, every choice that we make is a brushstroke on the canvas of our child's life. And our children, they're the future of this country, the future of our world. Our marriages are an example to our young generations of the virtues and the benefits of ethics and morality. They're an example of the virtue of having high standards and by living your life by a code. At least that's what they're supposed to be. Oh man, did we just get a little too serious here? Kind of felt like that, did it to you? Well, anyway, don't worry. We're going to have some fun with this, but it's going to be seriously serious fun. Okay, let's continue the roller coaster ride. Back to the virtues of marriage. Now, the problem is when our marriages don't exemplify these virtues, our young people, they see that and they become suspicious and they become cynical about marriage. You can't blame them, right? They're like, why would I get married?
Mom and Dad basically lead separate lives and are sleeping in separate bedrooms. Mom and Dad are miserable and haven't had sex in years. Why would they want that? Folks, this is a travesty and a tragedy all rolled up into one. It's a travesty because our failure at marriage, as God intended, has grossly misrepresented to the world the beauty, power, and divinity of the union of a man and a woman, and its true purpose, as we will reveal later on. And it's a tragedy that we believe it's greatly responsible for the Sodom and Gomorrah-like state of affairs in this world.
Let's face it, when you look around at what's going on in our country right now, it's a foregone conclusion that we've got a red alert DEFCON 1 situation. Now, if you agree with this, stay with us because we're about to reveal to you how the biggest problems that we're facing in society today are the result of a complete and utterly satanic disregard for the biblical mandates for marriage. And Satan has been able to pull this off because he's the master of deception. He's the ultimate magician. And we all know how magicians pull off their deceptions, right? It's by misdirection. While you're distracted by their scantily clad assistant, they steal the Rolex right off your wrist. But instead of stealing your Rolex, Satan is stealing our souls and our children's souls, and we have to get off the sidelines and start doing something about it. We have to get off the bench and begin exemplifying to the world the power and virtue in marriage. We've got to show the world that the marriage between a man and a woman and their life spent together is the optimal arrangement for human beings.
And how else can we know what that optimal arrangement looks like without going to the Bible? We have to have a solid frame of reference, a code, a blueprint, so to speak. And as we get into this, you'll see how the movements and trends in Western civilization today are diametrically opposed to the mandates that God has handed down to us in the Bible. And every time civilizations abandon the principles of God, they end up like Sodom and Gomorrah and ultimately in destruction. And the master deceiver has gotten us so distracted with alternative lifestyle options that we've lost sight of what is actually the optimal way.
So true. Remember, the Bible says that straight is the path and narrow is the gate that leads to life. And wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. In other words, the path to life is a path with fewer options. And sometimes there may be only one option. Oftentimes, when you choose to do the right thing, the options are few. There may be only one choice, but when you live your life without an ethical moral code, the options can be many. In fact, they're unlimited. But is that a good thing? Well, we've been deceived by the devil himself into believing that it is. But too many options always leads to confusion, discontentment, unhappiness, weakness, sickness, and destruction. That all sets the stage for this because when you see what God has mandated for us as married couples, what He has ordained for us, and you'll see how we have greatly departed from it. It'll become crystal clear how we've gotten ourselves into this rainbow-colored shit show that we're neck deep in. You'll see why suicide rates are at an all-time high, and you'll see why we have mass shootings like never before in history. You'll see why we have a generation of Peter Pan man boys that can't support a woman, and women who don't want to get married and have children, and for good reason. You'll see why, despite the plethora of information available to couples, why divorce rates are still really high and why there's a rampant level of marital dissatisfaction. Let's go to the Bible, let's let it do the talking and allow it to paint a contrast between what's going on in marriage today and what we should be doing. Shall we?
Let's begin as we reveal the 5 shocking truths about marriage in the scripture that we're going to call God's marital mandates. They unlock the code to having a fruitful, fulfilling, and meaningful life. We're going to ease into this and ramp up to the most explosive thing we've ever read in the Bible. And when I say explosive, you will wonder why this isn't being preached from the pulpits of every church in the world. Let's start with the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." That in and of itself, my friends, is a mouthful with implications worthy of discussion, but another time. Verse 27 says, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them." So the first thing of significance is that God created mankind after his likeness, male and female. Not only must they have been magnificent specimens of human beings, if we use the original precedence for gender as the precedence for gender, I think we can rest the case with regard to the gender issue. Verse 28 says, "God blessed them and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it.'" The first mandate to the first couple that God created and put together, the first mandate, you might say, was to be fruitful and multiply.
That, my friends, is diametrically opposed to the trend that we have going on right now. Couples not having children. It's like a not-for-profit business, right? What's the point? I mean, you can do business because you love being in business, but if you don't make a profit, it isn't sustainable because there isn't enough motivation behind it to make it work. There isn't enough motivation to improve, to get better, to grow, and to excel. And besides, as Christians, we complain about the world being overrun with other religions. Well, it's not because there are more people converting to them. It's because they're having more babies. They're using our own God-given directive to do what we're supposed to be doing. In this video, we're focusing on the code that God gave us, okay, to set us up, to be set up for a happy, healthy, fulfilling, and meaningful marriage that is an example and a launch pad for the next generation. Okay, Genesis 2, 23 and 24. I'm going to read the first part real fast to get to the part that's relevant to today's topic. "And Adam said, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh.'" Well, let's unpack this. There's 2 points. First, that a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife. This is God's second mandate that is key to a strong marriage. It's the leave and cleave principle.
Oh, to leave and cleave means that as a new couple, you are now independent from your parents and not under their jurisdiction. It means that you now prioritize your mate above anyone else, especially your parents. They did their job. Now it's time for you to do your job. For men, it's prioritizing and honoring your wife above your parents. For women, it's honoring and prioritizing our husbands above our relationship with mom and dad. In fact, your relationships with them must change. They must transition.
Yeah, that's for sure. You're not mama's little boy anymore, right? Or daddy's little girl. Oftentimes, our parents use their kids as emotional crutches for needs that aren't being met in their own marriage. But now that you're not under their roof, they need to figure their own life out and cut loose the apron strings. And if they don't do it, you need to do it. If you've got your self-esteem, though, wrapped up in your relationship with their parents, you need to start getting it on some level from your mate and not your parents. Marriage is about honoring the needs, the opinions, and the desires of your mate above anyone else's, especially your parents. After all, the second part of verse 24 says, "And they shall become one flesh." There are 2 implications to this statement, but the one that we want to address here is the implication that you are no longer 2 people, but one. And as Jesus said in Matthew 19:6, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Which takes us to the next biblical mandate for a happy, healthy, meaningful marriage.
Let's go to Matthew 19:3-9 in the NIV. In verse 3, the Pharisees came to Jesus and asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" In other words, they were asking him under what circumstances a man allowed to divorce his wife. Well, Jesus answered in verse 4 by reciting from Genesis 1 and 2 and combining two verses into one statement when he responds with, quote, "Haven't you read that in the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." So Jesus first answers the question by essentially saying that marriage is a permanent arrangement. Basically, he's saying that once you cross that bridge, you burn the bridge, there's no retreat. It's done.
But then, in the next few verses, the interrogators continue to press Jesus with questions about adultery as a justification for divorce. In verse 8 and 9 of Matthew 19, Jesus lays the foundation for why adultery is the slipperiest of slopes and why divorce is a non-win situation. It says, Moses permitted you, okay, referring to Levitical law, to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you, he says, that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. And as we know from the Ten Commandments, adultery is a sin. But this isn't a lesson in morality. We don't intend to preach to you, okay? But as a side note, if you've divorced in the past, this isn't a condemnation. We've all fallen short and trespassed the laws of God. And there is forgiveness and grace for us through Jesus Christ. However, this is a lesson in how to move forward in the best possible scenario. And if you study the contents of this video closely, you'll see that it's a lesson in what is optimal, okay? And what we mean by optimal is the scenario or the circumstances that give you the best results for you, for your family, for your community, and for the world at large. So let's unpack this a bit and see if we can identify what God considers optimal for a couple.
First of all, God said that a man and a woman once joined together as one flesh with the inference that you would never separate. If we took that seriously, don't you think it would change how we do our marriage? Don't you think it would dramatically change the level of focus and attention that would go into your marriage? Don't you think that it would influence the level of commitment that you would bring to your relationship? Wouldn't it change how resourceful we might get when it comes to solving and working through our marriage problems? The problem today is that we go into marriage knowing divorce is an option if things don't go as expected. The fact is, if divorce wasn't an option, most couples would work through their problems. In a study by the American Institute of Values, 80% of those who rated their marriages as very unhappy said they were happily married 5 years later when they stayed in the marriage. This is because marriage problems aren't problems at all. They're just symptoms that something needs to change, and that change usually parallels personal growth. That change happens when we bump up against our own personal limitations and we push through them. That kind of change and personal growth that comes out of it takes commitment. It takes courage. It takes love. It takes learning how to love. And when we come out the other side, we're better people. We're better examples of human potential. We're closer to exemplifying the divine to our children and to the world. We show future generations that indeed what God has put together is intended to stay together for our own good and for the good of our kids.
The first part of this demonstrates the virtues of staying together. The second part of this demonstrates the extreme downside to divorce. So back to the Bible. In Matthew 19, 8 and 9, it explicitly says that divorce for any reason other than infidelity is adultery. Furthermore, anyone who marries or sleeps with someone who's committed adultery commits adultery. I mean, man, this is getting kind of ugly, right? But hey, divorce is ugly. You see, In God's eyes, infidelity, adultery, and divorce, they're all slippery slopes with a potentially endless negative feedback loop. So I think you can do the math. So we won't say any more about that, but that isn't the worst part of divorce. The worst part of divorce is the impact it has on our kids. Even when they're adults, divorce is a major tear in the very fabric of society. I mean, it really mucks people up. That's why Satan loves it so much. Besides being the second most stressful life event that anyone can endure, I mean, statistically, children of divorced parents, they really get twisted up. They've got higher levels of depression, higher mental health issues, higher levels of suicide, higher drug addiction, higher alcoholism, and as you might have guessed it, higher divorce rates. Okay, let's move on to the next biblical mandate for marriage that the devil really hates. In fact, he hates it so much that there have been radical movements in this country to neutralize its power. But more shockingly, the biggest movement to stomp out the power of this next mandate has come from within the Christian church itself. It's time, ladies and gentlemen, to talk about sex. So let's go to 1 Corinthians 7, 1 and 4 in the Bible and start having some fun. You ready to have some fun? I think it's about time. All right.
Sex and marriage. We're going to talk about biblically prescribed sex. You know, when you get a prescription from your doctor, it's for something to make you better, to take away the pain and make life more enjoyable, right? Well, it's the same with biblically prescribed sex, only this time God wrote the prescription. You see, the puritanical view on sex that has proliferated in most Christian denominations, that sex is dirty, that it is something to be ashamed of, is actually the work of the devil. Remember, the devil is the ultimate deceiver, and he deceives by corrupting, distorting, and twisting the truth. The devil has used the church to undermine the power of marriage by making sex a necessary evil, something you talk about in hushed tones, something you must do but somehow must feel guilty about. This view of sex has made it something that people have felt guilty about and consequently avoided exploring to its full potential in committed relationships. As the devil would have it, if a man's and a woman's natural desires for sex are not met within the marital relationship, it opens up one to temptations of finding sexual fulfillment outside the marital relationship.
So, let's see what the Bible has to say. So this is 1 Corinthians 7:3 from the New International Version that we're going to read you. This is a chapter commonly known for its principles for marriage. So here it is. 1 Corinthians 7:3. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. In the New American Standard Version it says, the husband should give to the wife her conjugal rights. The New Living Bible says, the husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife her husband's needs. The next two verses prove this. Verse 4 says, the wife gives authority over her body to her husband, and the husband gives authority over his body to his wife. Now verse 5 says, do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time so that you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. Wow! All I can say is, wow! The only provision in the Bible that it has for denying each other sex is by mutual consent for a time to pray.
I love this text. Don't you love this text? And then it says, continuing in verse 5, afterward, you should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control.
Right out of here, guys.
You see, marriage is designed to provide for our needs so that we don't fall into the traps of fornication and adultery. When we are completely filling each other's needs as God intended, our focus can then be on fulfilling our individual missions here on earth instead of being in survival mode trying to get our needs filled. This is a beautiful thing, my friends. Marriage is intended to be highly sexually fulfilling. Marriage is about taking the question completely off the table of when, where, and how will my sexual needs be fulfilled. This is why Satan hates this so badly. He has deceived people into thinking that marriage is this fast track to no sex or limited sex.
That's right. Satan has deceived people into believing that sex in a loving, committed Christian marriage is an oxymoron. Satan has deceived people into believing that sex is dirty, immoral, and somehow ungodly. He's also deceived people into thinking that sex in a committed marriage is optional and that it's conditional. Now, I know that if I thought that it was optional and conditional, I would have had a second thought about getting married, even to Kimberly. I guess neither one of us probably ever really thought about it then. When people believe these untruths, these deceptions, they become vulnerable to sexual sin, to adultery, to pornography, and even to prostitution. It's exactly what Satan wants. He has perverted our views of sex so that we inevitably find sexual fulfillment outside our marriage. And then what happens? Pain, suffering, disillusionment.
But when marriage is enjoyed the way it was intended, the deceptions and vices of sexual activities outside of marriage aren't a temptation. And when your needs are being filled at a high level at home, your energies are freed up to be focused on your mission in life. I think that's so cool, don't you?
Well, I sure do. What could be cooler than God telling us in His Word that we need to be having a lot of sex in our marriage? Well, it's this next thing. Because as Kimberly and I just said, having a sexually fulfilling marriage, it frees us up to focus on our mission in life. And what is that? Be prepared to be blown away by this next revelation that we're going to find when we go to Ephesians 5. So here it is. Brace yourself. Ephesians 5:22. But wait, before we reveal this next and final mind-blowing truth, we need to give you some context. The next text was written by the Apostle Paul, who is arguably the wisest man ever to live next to Christ. Of the New Testament's 27 books, Paul penned 14 of them for sure. The Apostle Paul wrote more about the life of Christ and his teachings than anyone else in the Bible. His understanding of the everlasting, immutable teachings of Jesus Christ was unparalleled. So when Paul declares the ideal, optimal, most perfect arrangement between a man and a woman in Ephesians 5, his words must be taken seriously. So before I read this, let me first ask you a question. What if God gave us the perfect blueprint for a marriage, the perfect model? Would we follow it? I mean, that kind of goes without saying, right? And what if all of God's directives in the Bible, including His directives about marriage, are by design the best possible case scenario for us if we follow them?
I don't think that's a big stretch, do you? I think it's pretty safe to say that if we follow God's plan, happiness and harmony will be the result. Not only that, I think it's safe to say that when we do what's best for our marriage, we're doing what's best for our kids. And when we do what's best for our kids, we are doing what's best for the future of our nation. And so by the same token, it would stand to reason that if we don't follow God's blueprint, we're going to end up with pain, frustration, and unhappiness. Let's face it, the culture and societal trends we are all following on some level probably aren't in our best interest. In fact, wouldn't you agree that we're probably in direct opposition to the design that God has for us? I mean, okay, we just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Here it is, Ephesians 5:20-24 from the New Living Translation. And give thanks for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And further, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And now for one of the most enlightening texts in the Bible. Quote, "For wives, this means submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For a husband is the head of his wife as Christ is the head of the church. He is the Savior of his body, the church. As the church submits to Christ, so you wives should submit to your husbands in everything."
Don't go anywhere, it gets better. Then the Bible says, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her." Oh geez, now we're opening up ourselves to controversy, right? Well, this one's going to make a lot of people mad, but don't kill the messenger. We didn't make this up, and it's not an opinion. We're just delivering a message directly from the Bible. This is key to God's formula for a good marriage, and it's only offensive if it's not completely understood and if it's only partially implemented.
A formula only works if you follow it in its entirety. Isn't that right? If you're making bread and you leave out the yeast, you don't end up with bread. You end up with crackers. When most people, women in particular, when they read these passages, they get stuck and hung up on the, quote, "wives submit yourselves to your husband's" part. But they never get to, quote, "Husbands, love your wives even as Christ loved the church and gave his life for it" part. The reason this text is so offensive to many women is that for the most part, men have historically dropped the ball in the performance of their side of the equation. You see, this is an equation, and here's how it works. When a wife submits herself to her husband in all things, and a husband loves her and sacrifices for her as Christ did for the church, you will get an optimal relationship. How do we know this, Tad?
Well, there are three ways that we know this for sure. The first is that the Apostle Paul, who is the most prolific writer in the New Testament, he said so. The second way that we know is that this formula is a mirror. It's a reflection of Christ's relationship with his church. And what could be more beautiful and more perfect than Christ's love for his church and his church's love and adoration for him? I mean, do you think that Christ's church resents serving him? Do you think that they feel demeaned or diminished by loving, serving, and submitting to him? No way, absolutely not. Why? Because he loves them to a degree never before demonstrated. He demonstrated and he exemplified by his life the highest degree of love, compassion, patience, humility, and understanding. And he also demonstrated leadership and courage and strength. And ultimately, he demonstrated the willingness to protect and save his people with his own life. Now, this is the responsibility and the duty of a man, of a husband, and it's a heavy one. But this isn't about equality, and it's not about equity, to use a contemporary term, and it's certainly not about human value. It's about serving roles that we as men and women are best suited and best designed to fill so that we can have an optimal experience. What do we mean by optimal? Well, when we say optimal, we mean an extraordinary, fulfilling, and rewarding relationship that cultivates deep happiness, deep joy and love and passion for each other.
We mean a relationship that by design makes a couple a force for good on a level to be reckoned with. We mean being a couple that gives their children the best shot at leading meaningful and fulfilling lives as contributors to their community. In other words, being the best we can be comes from fully embracing and embodying the roles we were created for.
The third way that we know this formula is optimal is because it has helped us turn our own relationship around many times. When we've struggled with loss of polarity, loss of attraction, or we found ourselves fighting over our differences. It's when we've discovered that trying to share the same levels of responsibility in the same things, in other words, the contemporary concept of equality, when we try and do that, we've lost attraction for each other because same doesn't attract fame.
Ooh, and besides, what's generally optimal in any situation is two very different but complementary components that when combined produce a magical result, like olive oil and balsamic vinegar, like chocolate and peanut butter, like a man and a woman.
Men have a natural need and proclivity to build, to provide, and to protect. And doing so feeds our sense of purpose and our need for significance.
Women, on the other hand, have a natural proclivity for compassion, for nurture, for intuition. They have a natural need and proclivity to be protected and provided for. Women who are naturally feminine, which is most women, lose the virtues of their feminine essence when they have to provide for themselves and protect themselves. Can they do it? Most certainly. Is it an optimal scenario for them? No, because it puts them into survival mode, and when a woman is in survival, it's difficult, if not impossible, for her to be truly happy. When women also naturally don't like to have to make difficult decisions, but being forced to make decisions with significant consequences puts them into survival. And when they're in survival, they're tapping into their masculine energy, and when they're in their masculine energy, not only is it difficult for them to be happy, they lose their attractiveness to their masculine mate. This isn't to say that women can't make decisions or even tough decisions. It's just that we don't want to have to do it if at all possible.
So true. But on the other hand, for a man to be truly fulfilled and have a deep sense of meaning in his life, he needs to be building something, creating something, providing for somebody, and protecting them. I mean, that's how we're built. These things are enormous responsibilities for us. but they're what gives us significance. And women are, without question, the inspiration for all of it. I mean, without women to inspire us, to refine us, to guide us with their eternal wisdom, and to compel us to be better, civilization wouldn't exist and we'd probably kill ourselves off. I mean, you ladies, you're the reason we do everything. But unfortunately, we haven't been taught how to be the man that God intended for us to be for you. And I'm convinced that if men had their shit together and were fulfilling their roles as intended, women and wives would never have felt suppressed by patriarchy. And the feminist movement would not exist altogether. And we're just scratching the surface of the implications of Ephesians 5. And interestingly enough, this passage in Ephesians ends again with Paul reiterating Genesis 2, where he says, "A man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And then it says, "This is a great mystery." What is this mystery? Well, this, my friends, is the whopper of all whoppers. This is one of the biggest reveals of our lifetime. This is the most explosive truth we have ever seen. So listen closely. If you don't get it, please back up and listen again. The mystery of God creating man and woman to leave their parents and to be joined together and to become one flesh in perpetuity is to demonstrate to the world the relationship of Christ to his church. The grand purpose of marriage, my friends, beyond being fruitful and multiplying, is to exemplify to the world the relationship of God to his people.
In other words, marriage is the ultimate metaphor for God's love for and devotion to his church, and the love, devotion, and reverence of his church has for him. That is, when it follows God's formula and is executed according to God's divine plan. This, my friends, is what it means to be true power couple, a power couple for Christ. I hope you are getting this. Can you see why Satan would make war against marriage? If marriage is the ultimate exemplification and demonstration of the virtues of following Christ and living according to his principles, it will most certainly be the biggest focus of Satan's attack. Because if he can undermine marriage, everything else just falls apart.
And the more we resist following the formula that God has laid out for us here, the more we are fighting against ourselves. And ladies and gentlemen, as you read and you contemplate these passages, don't make the mistake of focusing on what your mate's role is in this. Focus on your role and how to fulfill it to the max. And believe me, that's something you can only do with the Lord's help. Because how can we, through our relationship, exemplify the love and the power of God without the love and power of God working on us and through us? This, my friends, is the missing link. But with God, all things are possible. Thanks for watching, and God bless you.
Thank you for watching.